Japan, the land of the rising sun, a nation renowned for its technologically advanced cities, traditional cultural offerings and immense natural wonders, which together make for one of the most sought-after tourist destinations in the world, attracting millions of visitors each year. Surprisingly, however, this level of openness to outsiders is a relatively recent phenomenon in the nation's history. In fact, for well over 200 years, from the 17th to 19th centuries, Japan's borders were firmly closed to any outside visitors whatsoever. This time period, known as Sakoku, bore witness to a flourishing of Japanese culture, rapid economic growth and dynamic societal developments which up until that point had never been seen before. As a result, this gifted the nation with many of the iconic cultural treasures whose legacies have survived to this day. But how did this island nation undergo such a dramatic transition from a period of relative isolation into becoming one of the most developed and open countries in the world today? This is the history of music Japan. All of our videos are available to watch ad-free over on our Substack page. You can also read along to the original scripts as well as listen to the audio narration as podcasts by following the link in the video description below and subscribing with your email. Thank you. The archipelago of islands that make up the modern nation of Japan have been inhabited for the best part of 40,000 years, with the first human settlers migrating there from mainland Asia. These early inhabitants brought skills such as agriculture and metal working with them, which laid the groundwork for the establishment of permanent settlements and eventually the earliest kingdoms. By the 3rd century AD, a significant portion of southern Japan had coalesced into a centralized power structure based around the Yamato region, which was ruled under a system headed by a monarch known as the Emperor. Much of Japan's early history would be shaped and influenced by cultures from the Asian mainland, with Buddhism being introduced to the region in the year 552 from Korea, and later in 645 a series of reforms known as the Taika reforms being implemented to remodel the political landscape of the country and mirror the Chinese system based around an imperial court. This court initially did not have a permanent home and was moved to a different location with each passing emperor. That was until 794, when Emperor Kamu decided to fix the capital in one place, modern-day Kyoto, thereby initiating the beginning of the Heian period, which was to last for almost 400 years. Over time, however, the imperial court became grandiose and too focused on internal politics, neglecting proper governance of the country outside of the capital and greatly weakening its own authority. As a consequence, the land that was formerly under the control of the emperor began to gradually slip into the hands of local noble elites, which despite being the de facto ruler of a now unified Japan, Hideyoshi did not assume the rank of shogun, possibly due to his peasant background, and instead ruled as imperial regent as well as chancellor of the realm. He intended to confer these titles upon his son, Toyotomi Hideyori. However, as Hideyori was still only a child at the time, Hideyoshi asked his 5 most trusted subordinates to pledge loyalty to his infant son until he was old enough to assume power. Upon Hideyoshi's death in 1598, civil war erupted once again among the Japanese daimyo, with Hideyori's allies on one side and those loyal to Tokugawa Ieyasu, who had formerly been loyal to Hideyoshi, on the other. The decisive battle occurred at Sekigahara in 1600, with Tokugawa Ieyasu emerging victorious over his rivals, ushering in a new era for Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate, which was to last for 268 uninterrupted years. This period, also known as the Edo period, was named due to the shogunate government relocating to the city of Edo, now modern Tokyo. It is perhaps the most defining era in Japanese history. The relative peace and stability that settled over the nation allowed Japanese culture, the arts, and the economy to thrive during a time of prosperity. However, it came at a price, as the Tokugawa shogunate implemented a series of strict punitive measures to suppress any potential social unrest and heavily restricted the spread of Christianity within the country before eventually banning it entirely in 1638. To prevent any further foreign influences from taking root in the nation, the 3rd Tokugawa shogun introduced a policy known as Sakoku in 1639, which effectively closed the country to outsiders and prohibited Japanese people from traveling abroad, returning from overseas, or constructing ocean-going vessels. Limited trade was only allowed with neighboring China and Korea, and the only Europeans granted a trading license were the Dutch, who were confined to the small island of Dejima in Nagasaki. The remainder of the 17th century saw Japan continue to thrive and prosper under the successive Tokugawa shogunates, with the population doubling to 30 million and the government building roads and schools to significantly enhance the socio-economic output of the nation. However, by the late 1700s and early 1800s, cracks began to appear in the shogunate's strength. The rapid agricultural growth that had characterized the early years of the Edo period had ceased, and the government's response to devastating famines during the 1830s was grossly inadequate. Meanwhile, some Western ideas had gradually started to take root in the country due to the introduction of Dutch books that covered the latest European scientific discoveries, which were translated into Japanese and distributed from their trading base at Dejima. Japan's period of isolation would come to a sudden end in 1853 when a fleet of American warships led by Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Edo Bay. The US government aimed to open Japan's ports to international trade and was prepared to use military force to achieve this objective if necessary. Unable to counter the superior firepower of the US forces, the shogunate reluctantly acceded to Perry's demands and opened the nation to American commercial interests, later extending this policy to other Western powers such as Britain and Russia. This apparent capitulation to the Western powers angered many within Japan, particularly those from the southern provinces of Choshu and Satsuma. They quickly formed an alliance and, in 1868, convinced the young Emperor Meiji to issue a decree calling for the end of the Tokugawa shogunate. The armies of Choshu and Satsuma then marched on Edo, leading to the Boshin War and ultimately the shogunate's downfall. The emperor subsequently regained supreme authority over the nation, marking a significant change in Japan's governance. In 1869, the imperial court moved to Edo, which was renamed Tokyo, and this event signaled the beginning of the Meiji Restoration. This period witnessed Japan embarking on a new journey towards modernization, aiming to become a fully fledged nation-state on par with the Western powers. Under the Meiji government, priority was given to modernizing infrastructure with the introduction of railways, telegraph lines, and a universal education system, as well as lifting the ban on Christianity. The government also enlisted the expertise of hundreds of advisors from Western nations who shared their knowledge in various fields such as mining, banking, law, and transportation to aid Japan's modernization efforts. One particular focus was the military, which underwent significant adoption of the latest Western tactics and technologies. In 1877, this updated army was deployed to suppress the Satsuma Rebellion, which had erupted due to the grievances of local samurai who had seen their roles as the nation's traditional fighting force become obsolete in the face of a modern standing army. Japan's new military strength was also utilized in expanding the nation's territory overseas in an attempt to emulate the colonial possessions of many Western powers at the time. After securing control over Hokkaido and annexing the Ryukyu Islands, Japan turned its attention toward China and Korea in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. Japan's highly motivated and well-commanded forces achieved a remarkable victory over the larger military of King China, successfully annexing Taiwan. As a result, in 1902, Japan signed a significant military alliance with Britain to counter the rising threat posed by Russian expansion in the region. The inevitable confrontation with Russia ultimately occurred at the Battle of the Yalu River, which marked the first time in decades that an Asian power had defeated a Western one. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 culminated in the dramatic Battle of Tsushima, in which Japan's newly constructed navy virtually annihilated their Russian adversaries. These military successes enabled Japan to assert its dominance further across the region by annexing Korea in 1910, thereby establishing itself not only as a regional power but also as a predominant Asian power on the global stage. Motivated by these recent military victories and further aspirations to expand across the Asia-Pacific region, Japan joined the Allies in World War I with the objective of acquiring new colonies in the South Pacific that were nominally under German control. Following the war's conclusion, Japan participated in the Treaty of Versailles and enjoyed favorable international relations, bolstered by its membership in the League of Nations. However, like many other nations during the post-war period, a growing nationalist and fascist-inspired sentiment began to take hold within Japanese society, particularly within the military, whose expansionist ambitions were becoming increasingly audacious. These aspirations triggered the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, which saw further territorial acquisitions on the Chinese mainland and a growing distrust of Japan's intentions in the region by the international community. Alarmed by this aggression and escalating levels of expansion, the United States imposed severe economic sanctions on Japan to hinder any further war efforts. With the outbreak of World War II in 1939, Japan recognized the need to realign itself geopolitically with other nations that shared similar expansionist views and consequently forged an alliance with Germany and Italy in 1940, which further deteriorated its relations with the US. Japan also alienated other Western powers such as Britain, the Netherlands, and France by occupying additional territory in Southeast Asia and encroaching upon the European powers' colonial possessions. Ultimately, however, Japan's government, under the leadership of Prime Minister and General Hideki Tojo, decided that it needed to preemptively strike against the United States if it was to lift the economic sanctions imposed upon it and secure the recent territorial gains it had made in the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the American fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This assault prompted the United States to enter World War II on the side of the Allies and begin military operations against the Empire of Japan, which had by then conquered other territories in Asia, including the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. The Allies, led by the United States, engaged in a fierce and prolonged conflict across the Pacific against Japanese forces. One of the key objectives was to secure small islands with strategically placed airfields that could be used for launching bombing raids on the Japanese mainland. However, the increasingly costly and slow progress of the fighting led the United States to realize that a ground invasion of Japan itself would result in incalculable losses for their troops. As a result, they decided to employ a newly developed secret weapon to compel Japan to surrender. On August 6 and 9, 1945, the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, causing the deaths of well over 100,000 people. Japan's surrender was communicated to the Allies on August 14 and was publicly announced by Emperor Hirohito on national radio the following day. With the war over, Japan came under the occupation of Allied forces led by General Douglas MacArthur, who initiated the reconstruction process. The Japanese military was disarmed, and the government underwent a democratization process. Although Emperor Hirohito was allowed to remain in his position, he was required to publicly renounce his divine status, which had been a central tenet of the state Shinto religious system. Under the guidance of Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, Japan shifted its focus towards economic development rather than pursuing an aggressive foreign policy. By 1955, the Japanese economy had surpassed its pre-war levels, and by 1968, it had emerged as the world's second-largest capitalist economy. The following decade saw Japan establish itself as a global leader in automobile manufacturing and as a major player in the electronics industry, resulting in an economic boom supported by Japanese-made consumer goods. All of this post-war economic activity helped to reshape and mold Japan into the successful nation that it is today, one that ranks highly in almost every measure of global output and development, from economics to technology and even life expectancy. All of this is attributed to the diligent work ethic and perseverance of the Japanese people, who, after enduring hardship during the final stages of the world's most destructive conflict, chose to embark on an entirely different path toward rebuilding a modern nation-state that was free from the hostilities, divisiveness, and inequalities of the past.